Behind Joe DiMaggio's legendary fame was a secret he kept for 40 years, a little drawer, a silver key, and a promise no one knew about. To everyone else, he was the untouchable Yankee Clipper. But in his final moments, he revealed a hidden promise he made to Marilyn Monroe, one that changes everything we thought we knew about her life. Stick around, because the 3 words he whispered as the world went quiet will change the way you see his love forever. Joe DiMaggio sat in a chair that seemed too large for his thinning frame. He was clutching a heavy, tarnished silver key. The world was never meant to see it. His eyes were fixed on a locked mahogany drawer across the room, its brass handles dull with age. To the world, he was the icon of iron discipline and unbreakable records. But in this private sanctuary, he was simply a man racing against a ticking clock to settle a final debt of the heart. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and the faint, ghostly trace of a perfume that hadn't been sold in decades. Outside the hospital gates, a pack of reporters leaned against their cars, their long camera lenses pointed toward his window like predatory birds. They were waiting for a headline, but Joe was waiting for a miracle. For decades, he had moved through the world like a ghost himself, a living monument to a 1950s golden age. His friends knew not to bring up her name. They knew the famous DiMaggio ice would flicker in his eyes at the slightest mention. He had built that fortress brick by brick, until the man and the memory were fused into one silent entity. But today, the ice was melting. His hands, the same hands that had swung a 34-inch Louisville Slugger with the grace of a conductor's baton, were trembling. He reached for a single, faded telegram tucked inside a wooden box. It was yellowed at the edges. The ink was softened by years of being touched in the dark. It wasn't a trophy or a commendation. It was a fragment of a life that felt more real to him than the one he was currently leaving behind. He closed his eyes. Suddenly, he wasn't a frail legend. He was back in the bright, chaotic lights of a 1954 movie set, hearing the specific, rhythmic click of her heels on the pavement. He remembered the way she would lean into him, as if the rest of the world was just a backdrop. People thought they knew their story, the arguments, the mismatched lives, and the spectacular end of their marriage. But they didn't know about the quiet hours in the kitchen or the way she looked when the makeup came off. Joe had spent a lifetime protecting that version of her, the real girl, the one who was scared of the dark and just wanted to be held until the shakes went away. Even during the 1961 World Series, while the stadium roared for the pinstripes, Joe had stood in the dugout and scanned the stands for a flash of blonde that wasn't there. He was the center of the universe, yet he had never felt more alone. This solitude was a weight he carried through every public appearance, every gala, and every handshake with a president. To the public, he was the model of American dignity, but at home, the silence was deafening. He would sit in his study, the walls lined with photographs of his playing days, but his gaze always drifted to a small, unassuming porcelain music box that sat on his desk. It was a gift she had given him during their brief honeymoon, its melody a tinkling, fragile tune that seemed to echo the vulnerability of her spirit. When the world grew too loud with its gossip and its relentless curiosity, Joe would turn the small silver key on the bottom of the box. He would listen to the notes as they drifted through the air, imagining her sitting on the edge of the desk, laughing at a joke only the two of them understood. This music box was a piece of a ghost that kept him grounded when the grief threatened to sweep him out to sea. Joe remembered one night clearly, back when the world was still in black and white. They were hiding out in a small cabin, away from the flashbulbs of New York. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the wind howling through the pines. Marilyn had looked at him, her eyes stripped of the movie star glamour, and asked if he'd still love her if the lights ever went out for good. Joe didn't answer with words. He just took her hand, his rough, calloused palm covering her delicate fingers, and held on like he was trying to keep her from floating away. He realized then that he wasn't just in love with a woman, he was in love with a soul that felt like it had been bruised by the very world that worshipped it. He promised himself right then that no matter how many people stood between them, he would be her final harbor. In the years following her departure, Joe found himself at odds with the very industry that had made her a star. He watched with a simmering, quiet fury as the studios turned her life into a commodity, selling her image to the highest bidder while ignoring the human being he had loved. He often walked through the streets of San Francisco late at night, his coat collar turned up, a shadow among shadows. He would stop in front of the theater marquees and see her face 10 feet tall, glowing with an artificial light that never matched the warmth of her actual presence. He felt like a guardian of a sacred flame in a world determined to pour water on it. Every time he refused an interview or turned down a lucrative offer to tell his side of the story, he was reinforcing the walls of his sanctuary. He knew that some things were too precious to be shared with a public that only wanted the drama and never the truth. This friction between his private heart and his public duty defined his later years. He was often asked to speak at events, to be the living link to a glorious past, but his mind was always elsewhere. He remembered one specific night in 1975, standing at the podium of a crowded ballroom while the elite of New York society waited for a word of wisdom. Instead of speaking of batting titles or the thrill of the game, he looked out at the sea of faces and saw only the empty chair next to him. He realized then that he had spent more time loving her in her absence than he had in her presence, a realization that was both a comfort and a curse. He had become a man of shadows, moving through a world of bright lights while keeping his eyes fixed on the one light that had been extinguished too soon. As he clutched the telegram, a single tear tracked through the deep lines of his face. His heart hadn't failed. It had simply been waiting for a signal. The silence was suddenly broken by the sharp, rhythmic ringing of a telephone in his memory, pulling him back to a night he had tried 1,000 times to forget. He reached for the mahogany drawer, his fingers trembling over the one thing he promised never to touch until the very end. The ringing of that telephone in 1961 didn't just break the silence of the night. It shattered the fragile peace Joe had tried so hard to build since their divorce. It was 3 o'clock in the morning in a rain-slicked Manhattan. Joe could hear the muffled sound of the city taxicabs splashing through puddles outside his window at the Lexington Hotel. He reached for the heavy, black rotary receiver. His pulse skipped a beat. "Joe," a voice whispered, so soft it was almost a prayer. There was no need for introductions. Her voice was a melody he had memorized, though now it was frayed at the edges. She wasn't the shimmering goddess in that moment. She was just a girl named Norma Jean, lost in a house that felt too big. She told him she was frightened of the shadows dancing on her walls, and that the powerful men who claimed to love her only loved the reflection she cast on the theater walls. Joe sat up in the dark, his hand gripping the phone so tight his knuckles turned white. He wanted to shield her. He wanted to pull her through the wire. He spoke to her for hours. His voice was an anchor. He reminded her of the quiet walks they took when the world wasn't looking, and how he used to make her tea with 2 lumps of sugar, just the way she liked it when the cameras finally stopped rolling. He didn't lecture her or ask why she had called him instead of the famous directors. He simply listened to the sound of her spirit trying to find its way back home. In that dark hotel room, the bitterness of their past disagreements evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching realization that they were 2 halves of a whole that the world had tried to pull apart. By the time the sun began to peek through the heavy velvet curtains, her breathing had slowed. She thanked him for being the only man who ever looked at her and saw a human being instead of a gold mine. Before she hung up, she made him promise that no matter how far they drifted, he would always be the one to catch her if she fell. Joe gave his word. It was a vow. He didn't know then that the shadows she feared would eventually take her away from him entirely, leaving him to fulfill that promise in a way he never could have imagined. The call ended with a soft click, but the connection it forged that night became a bridge. If this story is touching your heart, please consider subscribing to join our community of storytellers. They decided right then that if the world ever became too dark for one of them, the other would be the keeper of the light, a light hidden in a small, velvet box Joe had just pulled from the shadows. The air inside the small diner in 1954 smelled of burnt coffee and rain. Marilyn sat across from Joe, her blonde hair tucked under a simple scarf. Marilyn reached into her handbag and slid a small velvet box across the cracked Formica tabletop. Joe didn't open it immediately. He simply placed his large, steady hand over hers. Inside that box lay a simple, silver key and a folded piece of paper with 12 handwritten words. She whispered that if the lights of Hollywood ever blinded her, she needed to know there was one place where the door would always be unlocked. It wasn't about money. It was about a sanctuary for the girl she used to be. Joe realized that he wasn't just her husband. He was the guardian of her soul. They spoke about a house by the ocean where the only audience was the gulls. Marilyn talked about wanting to learn how to cook a real Italian Sunday dinner, and Joe promised to teach her his mother's secret for the perfect red sauce. These were the moments of light, filled with the scent of garlic and the feeling of sand between their toes. But beneath the laughter was the heavy knowledge that the world wouldn't let them go easily. Marilyn leaned in, her eyes wide, and mentioned a midnight garden where she would wait for him if the world ever tore them apart, a place that existed only in their shared imagination. That night, they swore that no matter where life took them, they would keep a light on for one another. It was a promise of a homecoming that didn't require a map. If this story of a secret promise is touching your heart, please hit the like button to help us share their legacy. Joe tucked the box into his pocket. He didn't know that he would be the one left to keep the light burning for decades, standing alone against a world that wanted to turn her life into a tragedy. Even in his dreams, Joe was still running the bases, but the stadium was always empty. He would reach second base and look toward the stands, seeing her sitting there in a simple white sundress, waving a handkerchief. But as he rounded third, she would begin to fade into the mist, and by the time he hit home plate, the field would be overgrown with weeds and the sun would be setting on an empty Bronx. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of salt on his lips. These dreams were the only time he could still hear her laugh, a sound that was becoming harder to remember as the years piled up like dry leaves. He realized that the homecoming they promised wasn't going to happen in this life, but that didn't mean he was going to stop waiting. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning for 20 long years, a solitary figure moved through the morning mist of Westwood Village Memorial Park. He always wore a dark trench coat with the collar turned up. While the rest of the world moved on to new starlets, Joe DiMaggio remained anchored to a promise. In his hand, he always carried a half-dozen long-stemmed red roses, the petals so vibrant they looked like drops of life against the cold gray stone. To the onlookers, he was a man mourning a celebrity, but to Joe, he was a husband keeping a date. He would reach out and touch the bronze marker, his fingers tracing the letters of her name, with a tenderness that brought back the warmth of her skin and the smell of the salt air on that 1954 afternoon. The roses were more than just flowers. They were having a conversation. Each stem represented a day he wished they could have shared. He talked to her in the privacy of his mind, telling her about the baseball scores and how the world had grown a little colder since she had departed. He never missed a day, not even when his own joints began to ache with age. He was a man of few words. But here, he was an open book. The florists in the city knew the order by heart. They prepared the best of the crop, knowing these blooms were destined for a place where love refused to expire. Joe did it because she had once told him she was afraid that if she was no longer here, the world would simply forget. Joe had looked her in the eyes and vowed that as long as he had breath, there would always be a fresh bloom waiting for her. If this story of eternal devotion resonates with you, please tell your thoughts in the comments about a love that lasts forever. As the years turned into decades, people wondered why the deliveries eventually stopped. They assumed the fire had finally gone out, but they were wrong. The roses hadn't stopped because he forgot. They stopped because he had discovered something hidden in the back of an old Bible. The Bible was bound in cracked black leather, and inside page 114 he found a pressed wildflower from that diner afternoon and a single, handwritten note he had missed for 40 years. In the soft, waning light of a Florida afternoon in 1999, a young hospice nurse entered Joe's room and found the legend staring at a photograph so weathered it seemed held together by nothing but memory. He didn't hear her come in. He was miles away. The woman in the photograph was wearing a simple cotton kitchen apron, her hair tucked behind her ears, and she was laughing at something off camera with a genuine, unforced joy. She was holding a wooden spoon, a dusting of flour on her cheek. This was the Marilyn that Joe had kept hidden, the woman he had tried to save from the glittering cage of her own stardom. To the public, she was a dream, but to the man clutching the picture, she was the only reality that had ever truly mattered. Joe whispered that people always thought she wanted to be a queen, but all she ever really wanted was a home. He spoke of the quiet Sundays they spent away from the flashing bulbs, when they would dream of a life where they were just Joe and Norma Jean. He remembered how she would read poetry to him while he sat in his armchair, and how she once told him that his arms were the only place where the noise of the world finally stopped. It was a domestic paradise that was taken from them far too soon, leaving him with nothing but this square of paper. He had carried this secret image through every lonely night, using it as a shield against the hollow versions of her story told by strangers. He knew that the woman in the apron was the one who was waiting for him on the other side of the veil. As he tucked the photo back into the sacred pages of his book, a serene smile crossed his weathered face. He knew that his time to depart this world was drawing near, but for the first time in decades, he wasn't afraid of the dark. He could feel the room growing cold, but the scent of her perfume was becoming stronger. A skeptical lawyer stood in the hallway, checking his watch and wondering if Joe's mind was still intact enough to sign the final papers. But Joe was no longer concerned with signatures or estates. He reached for the silver key one more time, finally understanding the true meaning of the message she had left for him. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor in the darkened hospital room sounded like a ticking clock. Outside the window, the Florida palms swayed, but inside, the air was still and heavy with the weight of a legendary life nearing its final curtain. Joe DiMaggio lay beneath the white sheets. He was listening to a sound that had been missing from his world for 37 years, the light, melodic trip of a high-heeled step. His family stood by the bed, their faces etched with the sorrow of losing a giant, but Joe seemed to be elsewhere. To the medical staff, he was a 94-year-old man whose heart was finally surrendering. But to Joe, he was a young man again, standing at the edge of a great divide, waiting for a signal he had been promised in a quiet diner so many decades ago. He reached out a hand, searching for a familiar touch in the darkness. He had survived the passing of his friends, the fading of his fame, and the long, cold winters of a house that never felt full after she was gone. But now, that legendary reserve is finally falling away. He wasn't the Yankee Clipper anymore. He was just a man. He had missed his wife every single day for half a lifetime, and he was tired of being the one left behind. The room began to feel different. The light from the hallway was taking on a soft, ethereal glow. Those who were present said that a look of profound peace suddenly smoothed the lines on his weathered face. He was no longer fighting for one more breath. He was leaning into the transition. He knew the world would mourn the athlete, but he was only interested in the woman who was standing just beyond the reach of his physical sight. If this story of a love that transcends time has touched your soul, please share it with someone who needs to believe in forever. As the monitors began to draw a long, steady line, the silence in the room was broken by a scent that made the nurse gasp the unmistakable, sudden fragrance of fresh jasmine and roses. Joe's lips began to move, forming words that were barely a whisper, as the light in the room shifted from the pale blue of evening to a brilliant, blinding gold. The golden hour of the Florida coast turned the sterile walls into a canvas of amber. It was in this shimmering moment that the scent of Chanel No. 5 suddenly filled the air. Joe's eyes flickered open, but they weren't looking at the medical equipment. He was looking toward the doorway, where the light seemed to be swirling and dancing in a way that defied the laws of physics. Joe saw a silhouette that made his heart give one final, joyful leap. It was the curve of a shoulder he had held 1,000 times, and the shimmering halo of hair that had once been the most famous sight in the world. She wasn't standing in the shadows of the past. She was standing in the doorway of his future, looking exactly as she did on that first day they shared a plate of pasta in 1952. The silence was replaced by soft, internal music. Joe felt the heavy weight of his 94 years begin to lift. He realized then that the lonely decades walking this earth without her were just a brief intermission. Every rose he had delivered and every silent prayer he had whispered into the night had led him to this threshold. He wasn't approaching the end. He was finally arriving at the beginning of the only dream he ever truly wanted. The figure in the light didn't speak with words, but Joe felt her presence like a warm blanket. She reached out a hand, and for a split second, the veil became so thin that the nurse felt a sudden breeze that smelled of California sunshine. Joe's face, which had been a mask of stoic endurance, transformed into a portrait of pure, childlike wonder. He leaned forward slightly. The gold light in the room grew so intense that it seemed to swallow the shadows, leaving only the two of them in a private universe. As his lawyer leaned in close to catch what he thought would be a final instruction about his massive estate, Joe's voice suddenly returned, clear and strong. It was a secret worth more than gold. He was about to utter the 3 words that had been locked in the vault of his soul since 1962, but first he had to tell them where the key was hidden. The lawyer leaned in so close that he could hear the faint, uneven rasp of the legend's breath, pen poised over a notepad. Everyone in the room held their breath. They expected a decree about his legacy or his memorabilia. But Joe DiMaggio was no longer interested in the things of this world. His gaze was fixed on a point where the golden light coalesced into a familiar, radiant smile. His lips moved. They were dry and weathered like parchment. He fought to find the strength for one final declaration of the heart. He ignored the cameras of his memory and the cheering crowds of the stadiums. He focused instead on the invisible hand he felt reaching out to clasp his own. The struggle that had defined his long, lonely years vanished, replaced by a vulnerability that was more powerful than any home run. "I am coming, Marilyn," he whispered. The 3 words drifted through the room like a soft breeze through an open window. In that moment, the decades of mourning and the nights spent staring at a faded photograph in a Bible all found their resolution. It was a homecoming nearly 40 years in the making. The weight of his 94 years seemed to evaporate as he spoke her name, not as the world knew her, but as the woman he had loved with a fierce intensity. The 3 words weren't a surrender to the end. They were a joyful acceptance of a new beginning. The people in the room stood frozen. They saw the tension leave his shoulders. He wasn't losing his life. He was finding the only part of it that had been missing since that tragic August morning so long ago. As the final syllable of her name faded, a serenity settled over Joe that was deeper than sleep. The lawyer pulled back, the notepad empty of financial instructions but full of a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Joe's eyes remained open for a heartbeat longer, reflecting a light that didn't come from the Florida sun, before they finally drifted shut on this world. The news of his passing would soon span the globe, but the real story was just beginning, confirmed by a mysterious delivery arriving the next morning. The morning after the world learned that the Yankee Clipper had finally gone to his rest, a small flower shop in Los Angeles received a delivery request scheduled 20 years in advance. The elderly florist looked at the ledger with trembling hands. It was the final rose, the one Joe had paid for in the late 70s. This rose was not destined for the crypt where Marilyn lay, but rather for the very spot in a small, out-of-the-way park where they had shared their first private conversation away from prying eyes. Along with the flower was a simple, handwritten envelope to be opened only when his own journey was complete. The florist carefully selected the most beautiful crimson bloom and drove to the park himself, feeling the weight of a legendary love story coming to its final resolution. As he placed the rose on the weathered wooden bench, he opened the envelope and read the words that Joe had kept bottled up for more than half a lifetime. The note simply said, "Together at last, exactly as we promised." The florist stood there for a long time, watching the way the early sun caught the dew on the petals. He was witnessing the final chapter of a secret pact. The world would continue to talk about the tragedy of Marilyn Monroe and the stoic loneliness of Joe DiMaggio, but they would be wrong. The real story was in this single flower, a symbol of a man who never wavered. Joe had spent years being the guardian of her memory, a silent sentinel who made sure she was never truly alone in the dark. Now, the roles had reversed, and it was she who had reached across the great divide to lead him home. As the florist walked back to his van, he saw a stray golden leaf dance across the bench, settling right next to the red rose. We often think of Marilyn Monroe as a fragile shadow caught in a storm, but Joe DiMaggio saw a triumph of the human heart. In the quiet aftermath of Joe's own departure, we are left with the profound realization that true love does not have an expiration date. The story of Joe and Marilyn is often told as a series of missed connections, but through the eyes of the man who kept a single photograph tucked in his Bible, we see a different narrative entirely. We see that protecting someone's soul is the highest form of devotion. Joe taught us that fame and success are merely costumes we wear, and that the only thing we truly take with us is the warmth of the hands we held. He reminded us that there is a sacred power in the old and the quiet. The 3 words he whispered were not just a farewell, but a victory lap for a soul that had remained faithful through decades of loneliness. It is a story that speaks to every one of us who has ever lost someone and wondered if they were still listening. Joe's life tells us that they are. He didn't just love Marilyn for who she was on the screen. He loved her for the girl who wanted to read poetry, and in doing so, he made sure that the best part of her never truly was gone. As we look back on these 2 legends, let us remember them as Joe and Norma Jean, 2 people who finally found the peace that eluded them in the spotlight. Their story is a reminder that it is never too late to be the hero in someone else's life. Joe used his final breath to tell us that he was going home, giving us permission to believe that the end is never really the end. The legend of the Yankee Clipper and his golden girl remains etched in the stars. For Joe and Marilyn, the winter is finally over, and the sun is rising on a Tuesday morning where the roses are always in bloom and the laughter never fades. If this journey through their secret history touched your soul, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our community of storytellers. We have many more legends to uncover, and your support helps us keep their memories alive.